We are going to continue now with Dr. Cobi Ashkenazi. He already submitted his PhD thesis at the Royal College of Music in London. And today he will present his findings from his studies on the role of muscular co-contraction in skilled, healthy piano technique. So I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you, Laura, Sarah, and thank you everyone for being here. This has been a fascinating conference so far. I quite like the focused nature of these small conferences, and thank you to my dear supervisor, I suppose former supervisor. Now you're sort of just a colleague. Just. Because you invited me along to apply for this conference, so thank you. So, when I was about 2 years into this thesis, I had a sort of midway examination, and one of the examiners said, you know, the interesting thing about your project is not your topic, it's your methodology. Now, okay, he's not a pianist, and it's a project about piano technique, so that may not be particularly surprising, but today, in the interest of keeping things relevant and on topic within the theme of the conference, I will focus more so on the methodological decision-making that put together different studies in this thesis with particular sort of strengths and weaknesses that are complementary. I will give you some overview of the project, partly because I can't resist, and partly I think it will help to situate what we're talking about, not to be overly abstract. So as Laura Sarah has mentioned, we are talking about co-contraction, which is it's a kind of muscle use. We'll define it briefly. I don't have to dwell on the context here, given present company, but injuries are a big problem for many pianists, and learning to play well, a related challenge, is also a major focus for pianists of all levels and ages, essentially. And so pianists, though they report there's not a great deal of good resources both for prevention and for treatment of injuries. And okay, so as I've mentioned, some injuries are related to playing technique. And as George had mentioned about the metronome, it's been around for hundreds of years, and we still haven't really decided what to do with the thing, right? I mean, individually we have, but collectively there's no consensus. There's still heated disagreement if you go to this masterclass or that one over, is the metronome a useful tool or is it the devil incarnate? Well, okay, muscle use, different kinds of muscle use, it's the same idea. So we've been talking about these things for hundreds of years in relation to keyboard technique. I think the first treatise that we looked at in this thesis is Girolamo di Ruta from 1592. Of course, it's a translation to English, which I will now preface. That's a major limitation of the thesis. We only looked at English works and English translations of non-English works. Anyhow, so yeah, centuries-long controversies about muscle use in piano technique persist, and that's a big problem if we want to help pianists of today who would rather not get bogged down by such controversies. So that's what this project took as a starting point. And in this particular kind of muscle use, co-contraction, it's a long abbreviation, but I can demonstrate it quite simply. So let's take, for example, the biceps and triceps brachii in the arm. The biceps, the primary function when you contract this muscle is to flex the forearm in the elbow joint. Okay, it's closing the forearm, all right. And in opposition, in a sense, the primary function of the triceps back here is to extend the forearm in the elbow joint. Okay, now many people stop there and say, okay, then clearly when you want to flex, you use the biceps. When you want to extend, you use the triceps. It's not so simple. You may, at some times, use both. Actually, you may a lot of the time use both simultaneously. And the question then is, well, what does that do? Is that a good idea? Is it not a good idea? When is it a good idea? What beneficial and detrimental effects does it have? So here's this example that I've just demonstrated. And so the aims of the project were to look at this concept of co-contraction specifically in the context of skilled, healthy piano playing, because that's what we're hoping to impart 20 years down the road, unfortunately, to our dear pianists, myself being one of them. The backstory is that I was injured. I was a piano performance major. I was injured for several years. I underwent lots of retraining and different visits to kind of doctors and teachers, and it was a tough process to get back to playing healthily and then to playing at a level that I felt was improving, which are two related but different things. So a big focus of this project methodologically was an integration of theoretical and practical perspectives on this particular topic of co-contraction. And in addition to this integrational, integrative perspective, we also took extra care with terminology. That's why we have the term AMCC, antagonistic muscular co-contraction. I won't go into detail as to why we need that long of a label, but you can ask me if you're interested. And we used multiple systematic approaches to just enhance the rigor of the thesis. Okay, and this is one particular axe that I like to grind. Now, I think it's perfectly fine when we're studying musicians. We're curious about their expertise levels, so we may ask, okay, how many years have you been playing? Fine, that's okay. What degree do you have? No problem. Have you won any competitions? Okay. These are all very useful, easy, but quick and dirty representations of skill level, right? And speaking for myself, let alone for my observation of other pianists, say the criterion is, I've played piano for 10 years or more. Well, when I had played piano for 12 years, I was terribly injured. And when I had played piano for 14 years, I was slightly injured. And then 16 years, I wasn't injured anymore. And all of those would have just been, he's a skilled pianist. Okay, but there are many sort of shades of skill within those sort of base metrics. So we'll get into how we looked a little bit more carefully. There's still a lot of room for improvement. We looked a little bit more carefully at that performing level of skill and also their playing-related health. Okay, so the research questions are rather straightforward. What's the best way of using co-contraction if you want to be a skilled, healthy piano player? How does it relate? How do pianists use it to balance its positive and negative effects, which we'll very briefly look at? And to what extent are skilled, healthy pianists actually doing this? So the research questions also reflect our interest in a theory-practice integration, wherein we're not only interested in giving you this is what you should be doing, but what are those people playing near optimally actually doing? And does that actually reflect what we are trying to sell you or not, right? So it's a kind of built-in checking step. Okay, so the project had 4 studies. We'll go into each one very briefly, and starting with this scoping review about co-contraction in scientific literature. So we looked across over 100 different journals, databases with some quite standard terms, and just chose any paper that seemed to relate to co-contraction and any aspect of movement that could be relevant to piano playing, right? So elbow movement was in, whereas, say, throat muscle observations for singing were kind of out, because realistically it's not a big deal. And you can read part of this scoping review in our paper from last year, although it's quite abridged. Okay, so what did we find here? Well, we put together a model, a theoretical model of co-contraction's effects on human motor performance as relevant to piano playing. And this is a visual depiction of that model, so I know it's tiny. We're not model-centric today, so I'm not going into detail, but okay, we have positive effects of it, we also have negative effects of it, we also have characteristics of it. For example, does it differ between demographic groups, and what are some of its characteristics? How prevalent is it? Is it something that people are doing all the time, or is it rather rare, etc.? And we dug in quite a lot into remaining questions and sort of areas of improvement and limitation in the published literature. So I think we had about 187 studies, and so yeah, we rigorously generated a theoretical scientific model of co-contraction in relation to piano playing. Well, no one had done that. Anyone could have, but we did. Now the issue is, we found basically, okay, it has positive effects, it has negative effects. What do you do with that? That's kind of hard to operationalize to help a musician, right? Okay, and part of the reason for that is that this is all scientific inquiry, which is not being carried out by the actual individuals who are co-contracting while playing the piano in most cases. So there's a missing perspective of actual practitioner insight from this review. Okay, so that brings us to the sister review, which is a systematic critical review about co-contraction in pedagogical publications. Okay, so these are overwhelmingly not peer-reviewed, not in the scientific sense, and they go back all the way, as I mentioned, to 1597, the latest one in the review being in 2020. I gathered, 150 books and treatises, again, English and translations only, and then about 89 of them had relevant material pertaining to co-contraction, at least as best as we could tell. There are major concerns in this literature, often about terminology. So authors, it's fine if someone wants to define a word like tension, and they say that means that anytime you move, you're using tension. And if that reflects modern scientific usage or not, that's not the point. The point is, do they stick to that definition? Do they give you that definition at all? Or is it some sort of fanciful metaphor that's best suited for the moment of a lesson, but maybe not a published treatise? So we used our scientific model not to scold pedagogues, but just to see, okay, where do pedagogues align with that model, and where do they differ? And most importantly for this study, where do they say things that we did not find scientists talking about, particularly in regard to co-contraction and piano technique? Okay, so we can see just a couple excerpts of some diagrams from different treatises, one being on the right from Otto Ortmann, who wrote the sort of seminal physiological mechanics of piano technique in Baltimore in the 1920s, I suppose. He's an early piano scientist, and there was a great deal of analysis of terminological usage. Many terms in pedagogy relate to co-contraction, so tension, fixation, relaxation, stiffness, rigidity, elasticity, and so on. So we analyzed all of this. It was a systematic and critical review, so we needed to assess with as much certainty as possible what were they actually talking about. And so a large proportion of the excerpts that seemed relevant to co-contraction, they didn't pass that step of analysis because they remained that unclear. Like, we did our best, we're not trying to misinterpret them, quite the opposite. And it's quite understandable, especially prior to the information age and prior to the internet and prior widespread access to certain kinds of information. So this was all coded in terms of, okay, does it agree or disagree with different parts of our scientific model? That is to say, the excerpts that did show up, that were clear. And again, most importantly, we had some new contributions to that model. So I'll pick one example, which is multisensory effects. And so this came up a little bit yesterday. We've confirmed quite quite robustly now that there are multisensory perceptual effects on musical perception, that go beyond obviously just auditory, beyond just acoustic. And okay, of course there are many papers published on this, but why didn't that show up in our scientific review? Again, it's only in relation to co-contraction. So what this means is that piano pedagogues specifically wrote, 13 times that we could find, something like that, about multisensory effects in relation to the act of co-contraction. For example, several pedagogues would say, well, if you keep your elbow tense, and we're able to determine what they specifically meant by tense to mean co-contracted, while you are playing a melody, then your tone will be harsh. And okay, why can we say that it's multisensory? We won't go into that particular rabbit hole, but again, you're welcome to ask later. So that brings us to this simplified new addition to the model, and we can also see it in a much more complex form. This is showing every excerpt from all of the works that we've looked at and where they sat in with different categories of the scientific model and the one sort of shoot off of new contributions. So what did this do? Well, okay, we got new insight from pedagogues. That's very important. We also, in a sense, we empiricized. We didn't collect data, right? We'll get to that later. But this is one level more practice-based insight on co-contraction in piano technique compared to scientific literature. Why? Because these are the words of the actual people who are doing the thing and teaching the thing, including all of the limitations and flaws of those people's discussions. So yes, it's unscientific, very, let me tell you, and unverified. I mean, yeah, this person in 1936 said that all piano playing begins at the waist. Well, that's nice. I mean, that's, maybe they were right, they're not right. But even if they were right, that's not verified, right? And yeah, as I mentioned, major problems with inconsistency and contradiction. Okay, but that's okay, because we have these two sister reviews. So we have the rigorous scientific one, which is a little bit top-heavy, and it's a little bit more abstract, whereas we have the pedagogical one, which is quite messy and unverified, but we also found significant connectivity between those two models in addition to the new contributions, and that, hopefully it won't crash. Yeah, so that's another visualization of the two put together, and that helped us begin to reconcile science and pedagogical views. And there are great disagreements, as mentioned, within and between these two schools of thought on this. Now again, okay, it's a little bit more empirical, but it's still quite conjectural. So we haven't done anything. We haven't prodded anyone with a stick and thought if their muscles are doing this thing or not, okay? So we'd better do that. 5 minutes, thank you, great, okay. So the first thing that we did is a content analysis. So I had written 100,000 words of piano technique journals over 7 years or so. And so I analyzed those, put them into thematic categories, and there's all of the excerpts, and I built another model. It's the same idea, right? So you have characteristics of co-contraction, you have effects of optimal co-contraction, maybe some of the effects are negative if you're using it in a different way, and some sort of general thoughts on its characteristics. This is the model that arose. Again, we're not model-centric. If you're interested in these models, just ask. And you can see a little bit of zooming in, which we'll zoom through. So there are different topics, very specifically physical ones, like, say, movement and directionality in this or that plane, whereas you may also have more cognitive and psychological ones as to the sensations that you experience and sort of how you think about developing this part of your playing, if you think about it at all. Okay, so we've got that prior model, which was conjectural, but it did integrate science and pedagogy, and now we've got an actual bottom-up model, right? And so now we're saying, okay, this is again one step more empirical. Limitation being it's non-generalizable, it's a case study of one individual, me, my subjective experience. Okay, but that's the complementary weakness because the early is not a lot. So the final study is a initial verification of parts of this model. So we used electromyography and we examined pianists' elbow co-contraction during their playing. And they were able to play anything they liked for about 10 minutes. Then they were asked, optional, because they're at varying levels of skill and to sort of study, to play scales, arpeggios, octaves in predefined keys. Thank you. And one bit of sight reading. Okay. So there we've got the wireless EMG, and there's a little tidbit showing the biceps and triceps co-contraction while playing, and a little bit of case-by-case analysis, as well as some inferential group-level analysis. Okay, so what did we find there? Well, we found many parts of this unified model to be supported by our rather small initial data set. Okay, so again, it's an initial step, but if we had done this and we had these results with 900 people, it would be great, okay? Now, one last methodological step to take here is if you go from those intersections and then highlight the other themes of either model that were seen as connected. So that's a methodological propagation. It's not an empirical validation. Obviously, we didn't validate these 1,000 different lines. It's just if the lines that we did validate are indeed connected to the other lines and parts of each side of the model, then we can hypothesize that these things are connected. Okay, and that's essentially what I'm saying here. Yeah, I think I'll just wrap it up there. The long story short on co-contraction is it's very important, but do it dynamically and in a musically organic context. Don't do it statically or arbitrarily just because someone told you to do it. That's the 5-second pitch on what we found. But yeah, hopefully that just gives you a sense of how combining these different approaches, and it's right, it's qualitative and quantitative, it's multimodal as well as multi-methodological, gave us more robust outcomes that we're able to shout out with a little bit more confidence. So thank you.
Thank you, Cobi. Do you have questions?
Thanks. As a pianist, of course, this is very, very interesting. It is half a question, half a comment, because as we learned it at the conservatoire, it was less is more, especially with the piano and the injuries that happened, that it was actually a bit the emphasis. So don't do too much, don't just do a stupid repetition, that every time you do it, you have to be there. So if you are not there in your head, so you're not concentrated, it doesn't bring anything. There is no value to it, and you just risk to enjoy yourself. I guess this is the same conclusion you drew.
It's very related. If I bring us back to one of these zoomed-in spots, I think what you're talking about being there, it relates, of course, as well to embodiment, which we've heard about, and I would point to here in the bottom sort of branch about sensations and also the ideomotor theory, which we didn't get into, but it's basically the idea of not putting the cart before the horse. What we're doing is trying to play music, which is a form of human expression. So if you're not there, as in the way that you've said it, you're just repeating something and expecting it to get better, you've already broken those rules. They're not really rules. Less is more is also a key point. And the findings are quite interestingly complex on this, specifically about co-contraction. Now, most papers in previous eras and most pedagogues would say, yes, less is more. And in some cases they will point to, for example, the observation that as someone is more of an expert, then they seem to use less co-contraction to accomplish the same tiny experimental task. And so what we found here is that does happen, and there may be other operations, other implementations of co-contraction that increase as expertise is accumulated at the same time, maybe in a different joint, maybe in a different limb, maybe even in the same one at the same time. So it's quite complex in that. So beginners using too much co-contraction, part of it seems to be they are reducing the degrees of freedom to make the task simpler. So that's why you will sometimes see beginners who play with a very stiff shoulder or elbow, even if it's not due to performance anxiety, right? That's a different issue. Whereas it's quite rare to see an expert world-class performer with some totally stuck joint, right? At the same time, that expert performer may be using a highly dynamic and variegated continuous co-contraction in the same joint. It just doesn't look stiff because it's not static. Why are they doing that? A bunch of different reasons we don't go into today. One of them, transferring force across that joint to the next segment. Okay.
I forgot to add about the tempo. So this was the other emphasis, is that especially when you have very technical pieces, I mean, we know what you're talking about, that are very often pretty fast and using many notes at the same time, having big arpeggios going everywhere, you know, the really difficult technical things, that the emphasis was always that the faster it is, the slower you have to practice it. Do you agree?
Well, I just read a new paper in Frontiers. It's a systematic review of piano technique. It's related to, it's like what I've done, but it's not about co-contraction. It's a lot more top level. Anyway, they wrote on this question specifically, and they, from the evidence they reviewed, they suggested that the ideal approach is for those very fast passages, alternating between very slow and very fast practice. What they did not like, according to the evidence they found, was a slow progression where you start at this and you click up by one, click up by one. Now again, that's just on the basis of whatever 6 papers which have their own limitations that they reviewed. So that's not at all a conclusive answer, but that's just the most recent published scientific evidence I can offer to that very ancient, venerable sort of question that professors, and you know, some of them like to practice in rhythmic groups. There are all kinds of different tricks that have been passed around for centuries.
Fascinating, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have more questions?
Thank you for the presentation, and I think it's a very brave task to try to this systemic approach to many writings that do not have the expectation to be scientific. My question is, why did you start with the ruta, and because the piano, the instrument was completely different, and obviously also the fortepiano is different from the 1840 piano, that is different from the Steinway B. But my question is related to how does this particular contraction, what role does it play on the ancient instrument, and how did you put the oldest treatises on the same level with the 20th century one and most recent one?
Thank you, it's an excellent question. So why did we start with the ruta? Because that's the first English translated treatise of any keyboard technique that we identified. So it wasn't a conscious decision. Now, as to, is that really relevant to technique on the modern piano? Of course, the answer is it's kind of relevant, but it's quite different at the same time, right? So the truth is, if you look at the list of included works, almost all of the works that we were able to include are from the 20th century. So there's a tiny bit of CPE Bach, there's a tiny bit of De Ruta. The one excerpt from De Ruta is inconclusive. So we analyzed it, we found it's relevant to co-contraction, but the terms as they were translated from whatever the Italian was like at that time, we're not able to tell what they're talking about. So the end result is, yeah, we think they're talking about this, but we don't know exactly what they meant, and we're being rigorous, so we're just going to say, move on. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one short question. No? Maybe you could explain at that point where you touched about sensory motor, that you commented the fact about the tension in the body and the harsh sound. And so just if you could...
Absolutely, yes. So in a previous study that George supervised me on, in the MSc, what we confirmed, what we isolated and confirmed, which has been talked about and debated for at least a century, not 400 years, is this audio-visual perceptual overlap, specifically in perception of piano tone color, or timbre, or timbre, right? Okay, and so what the sum of, or the essence of the debate has been, is that acousticians and engineers who look at the piano as a machine, which it is, and they identify correctly that it is impossible to vary the sound coming from the string without also varying the amplitude, the dynamic level. So what that leads them to conclude is that tone color, you can't do anything about tone color. All you're doing is about dynamics. And so there are pedagogues today and decades ago who will write to this effect. And okay, there's a detail which is the noise of your finger hitting the key, or if you're using a press touch, small detail, okay. Don't worry about that for the moment. Okay, so pianists obviously swear something completely different, right? They swear that we can affect in many infinite and meaningful ways the tone color of anything, okay, at the piano. Well, both are right, and the explanation is, in part, multisensory perception. So what we did in that study, we reduplicated identical audio, and then we spliced different videos. So for example, I would be playing a note like this with a raised finger, and then I would be playing the same note but with a scooping elbow motion and a soft, smoother wrist, right? Okay. And so the audio is exactly the same, then we synchronize the frame, then we ask, I don't know how many, we had 50 people or so in the survey, did you hear a difference in tone color? And if so, can you please describe the difference? And we threw in all kinds of different trials, right? So we're not only looking at these faked ones, we're also looking at real, just two notes that are actually different. Sometimes they're very subtly different, sometimes they're very obviously different. We even had one where the camera was zoomed in on my face, and I was just making a more expressive facial expression. And believe it or not, that affected the tone color perception. Remember, we use the word hear. Did you hear a difference? Yes, and it affected it how? Well, I don't know. They knew exactly how. It was, oh, this tone is more singing, this tone is lighter, this tone is brighter, this one was bell-like. I wasn't quite sure whether your face had anything to do with it, but I heard this. It's like, well, there you go. Okay. So in the case of your question about the harsh sound and the tight elbow, okay, well, if I play a chord, right, acoustically, objectively speaking, the sound is already being emitted. It's already decaying from the strings. There's realistically nothing we can do to affect that. But if I continue with a very tense and stuck follow-through motion, we will actually perceive that differently, both as a performer and as the audience. Then if I follow through and this joint is free and there's actually a sort of natural sequence of joints. It's not to say one is better than the other, it's that they have different effects. Sometimes in a Prokofiev sonata, you want that kind of strident and stiff awkwardness of articulation. So that's hopefully a beginning to answer your question.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.